And then he made a statement that would not let me go. And that was that over time, more CO2 has gone into the atmosphere from what has been done to the land, from faulty agricultural processes compared to the burning of fossil fuels. And that just absolutely hit me over the head. And so once I started looking at soil and how we have a whole carbon cycle, not just a kind of one-way street when it comes to carbon, that brought me right into all these ecological processes, and I haven't looked back since.
Hi, everybody. I'm Adam Sachs, Executive Director of Biodiversity for a Livable Climate. We're a nonprofit founded in 2013 that advocates for restoring ecosystems to address global warming. Every year, I become more and more convinced that bringing back life to 12 billion plus degraded and desertified acres around the world is by far the best way to address climate and the many other challenges to living systems. So welcome to our new monthly series, Life Saves the Planet. This talk is a collaboration between Bio4Climate and the GBH Forum Network. Our guests, Judith Schwartz and Ben Goldfarb, join us for our first monthly foray into learning about life as the most powerful force on Earth. Perhaps even more powerful than plate tectonics and erupting volcanoes. We'll touch on that more as we proceed through the season. Prepare yourself for exciting and inspiring insights. It's apt that Judith Schwartz's landmark first book, Cows Save the Planet, and Other Improbable Ways of Restoring Soil to Heal the Earth, was published in 2013, the year Bio4Climate was founded. Cows served as a guide for us, a map to help navigate the emerging world of biology on top, a long overdue end to physics envy. Since then, Judy has spoken at our events on several occasions, and together we have shared stories and reveled in awe at the wonders of the natural world. She followed cows with Water in Plain Sight, Hope for a Thirsty World, with explanations and examples of how our water woes and our woes of mismanagement, and how technological dead ends are solved with relative ease when we collaborate respectfully with living nature. Reindeer Chronicles is her third book, about to be published, and you'll hear about it today. Ben Goldfarb is the author of Eager, The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter, winner of the 2019 Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. His work has appeared in publications including The Atlantic, Science, Orion Magazine, and The Washington Post. Ben has attended Bio4Climate conferences and says that they've informed his thinking on how important ecological solutions are in addressing the climate crisis. Not to mention that we do a wonderful job of promoting and elevating the role of beavers in eco-restoration. So Ben, why don't you get the reindeer running?
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that introduction, Adam, and thank you so much to Judy for speaking with me. I'm a great admirer of Judy's work, especially its remarkable solutions focus. You know, I think that we're so awash in negative environmental news, and Judy, I think, is one of the people who's really shining a light and leading us forward towards solutions. So I've always really cherished her work for that reason. So as Adam described, as he was going through your oeuvre, Judy, this theme of using nature to heal nature runs throughout your work, from the role of cattle and other large grazers to the role of forests and wetlands in mitigating drought. And of course, in this fabulous book, you've got reindeer and donkeys and whales and all kinds of large animals. I wondered how did this general idea of nature-based solutions become the kind of the dominant theme of your work? Maybe you could walk us through your own journey as an ecological thinker and writer.
Yeah, well, I came to writing about ecology from writing about economics of all kind of strange roots. But writing about new economics, which is the perspective that our economy should serve people and the planet as opposed to the other way around, really opened me up to a lot of things. And once you realize that the economy is something we create, but nature is, and start to see that nature is non-negotiable, whereas human design systems are by definition negotiable, and yet we're kind of looking at it the other way around. I responded to that cognitive dissonance, and more specifically, once I started exploring soil, just the way that nature worked, the way that every dynamic is so intricate and yet so, with so much symbiosis and synchronicity and all these wonderful ways that any problem that we could bring to nature, she has a solution. And it's just so compelling.
Was there a particular aha moment for you, a person or a project or a place that crystallized that for you?
There actually was an aha moment. So for me, here I was writing about economics, like I said, and I went to a conference, and this was the Slow Money Conference, which was held, oh my goodness, it's 10 years ago. It was held in Shelburne, Vermont. And the slow money movement is really a fabulous kind of approach to, well, it's at once a critique that money flows too rapidly through our system, kind of ever more abstract, chasing more and more marginal profits, and never does the work on the ground, because wealth is wealth and therefore can do work for us and serve us, as I said before. So I went to, and it's also the way that money is brought down to earth in the slow money program is to be invested in small and medium-sized food enterprises. So farms and locally based restaurants and caterers and bakers and orchardists and all these people. And those were all the people that were at this event. There were those people and then big money people, and that was kind of an interesting juxtaposition. Anyway, I was here, and someone named Will Rapp, who was the founder of Gardener's Supply, he's based here in Vermont, he gave a talk, and he was talking about soil. And I was thinking, yeah, right, soil. All right, soil, right. Soil is a metaphor for nurturing, for local economies. Yeah. Well, let's get rid of that. Let's get done with the soil stuff and get to the real stuff. And then he made a statement that would not let me go. And that was that over time, more CO2 has gone into the atmosphere from what has been done to the land, from faulty agricultural processes compared to the burning of fossil fuels. And that just absolutely hit me over the head. And so once I started looking at soil and how we have a whole carbon cycle, not just a kind of one-way street when it comes to carbon, that brought me right into all these ecological processes, and I haven't looked back since.
Yeah, it seems like, you know, having read your three books, it seems like the figure who kind of looms the largest or has most informed your thinking about soil and regenerative agriculture is this guy named Alan Savory. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about who Alan Savory is, how you became connected with him, and what exactly is his doctrine.
Yeah, okay, so the reason that happened is that at the time, like I said, this is 10 years ago, at the time, the only people who were talking about soil's capacity to build carbon and draw down carbon were people in the holistic management community. And that is the community that Alan Savory's work has sparked. So Alan is a wildlife biologist from Zimbabwe. And yeah, his work and observations are really foundational because he was looking straight at these problems of land degradation and the dynamics with animals. So basically, he grew up in Zimbabwe and he loved wildlife. I mean, you know, my husband is from Southern Africa, from South Africa, and I've been there and I completely, I mean, it's completely unbelievably wonderful to be amidst these creatures. So he realized once he became was working for the national parks, that the land didn't look as good as he remembered from his childhood, and the animals weren't as abundant. And he wondered why. At the National Park Service, they determined that, well, that must be because there are too many animals. But what happened was they set aside land, and they fenced off and they closed off the land, and they removed the people from the land, and that land got worse instead of better. So he puzzled this out over a long time and much observation. And so his observations were several. One, that grazing animals and grasslands co-evolved, so that the land needs the animals in the same way that the animals need the land. Now, I'm sure we can branch this out, and it doesn't need to be grasslands. That's one set of dynamics, but as you write on beavers, that wetlands and forest lands also co-evolved with animals. Right. So anyway, he made that observation. Also, that land can be overgrazed, but it can also suffer from not enough animal impact, and that there are different kinds of landscapes that have different dynamics. So he talked about the brittleness scale. So that lands where there are seasonal rainfalls, there's a different set of requirements for those landscapes to thrive, because you need to maintain moisture in the soil from the end of one rainy season to the beginning of the next. And he determined that the way that nature solved that dilemma was through herbivores that carry moisture through the landscape and stimulate different biological processes.
Right. Wow, that's amazing, and certainly it is something I think a lot about in Beavers. You know, my favorite bumper sticker is "Beavers taught salmon to jump," which I think kind of gets at the evolutionary depth. You know, the fact that whether you're talking about beavers or large grazers, you know, these are, as you said, these are animals that the land and, of course, other organisms co-evolved with over the course of millions of years, and that the loss of those species is a profound one in ways that I think we're just beginning to grasp. So I wanted to turn, so that was sort of, you know, going to Africa and experiencing a landscape with and without large grazers. You know, it sounds like a pretty formative event for you. I mean, turning to your current book, you know, reindeer are very much an extension of that concept, right? They're another large hoofed mammal that, you know, moves in big herds, but of course they're operating on the tundra rather than these African grasslands. So where do reindeer fit in here? In what ways are they like cattle, and in what ways are they unlike cattle, and how are they managed in this kind of unique Arctic context that you write about in the Reindeer Chronicles? Yeah,
so they are managed by reindeer herders. And actually this photo, I just want to mention, this is from a photographer reindeer herder herself named Sarah Nordengard. Yes, and she shared this with me. No, she does beautiful work. Yeah, so the herders move the reindeers in vast herds, vast numbers, between the summer grazing areas and the winter grazing areas. And what's interesting is that it's very different from what cattle do in grasslands, but at the same time has kind of parallel impacts. So basically, we can look at how the reindeer maintain the Arctic tundra, okay? So they keep that frosty landscape nice and cool. And there are several ways that they do that. One is by nibbling on the shrubs. So, you know, as we know, near the poles, the land is, the poles are warming faster than any other regions. So what's happening, I mean, it's a funny word, they're calling it the shrubification of the tundra, that larger plants are starting to get traction there. And so you're getting a lot of shrubs and brush that you wouldn't have had before. The reindeer nibble these down and manage them so that, one, they're not taking over, they're not getting a foothold in the same way. And also because by eating the leaves, they are, the shrubs are darker, so they have a lower albedo. They are less reflective than the snow. So by maintaining, by controlling them, they're managing how much heat is being absorbed in the landscape. So the native heath, you know, I'm thinking about their summer grazing, the native heath is light, and so it's reflective. And so by eating the leaves off the shrubs, they're managing that. Another way that's really also interesting is that by pressing down the snow with their hoofs in the winter, they are crushing the snowpack, you know, which sounds like a bad thing. It sounds like, oh no, they are ruining that beautiful snow. Right. However, the snow has an insulating quality. So in a way, it's protecting this, when a full bunch of snow is kind of keeping it not cold. But when the reindeer are pressing down the snow, the ground beneath freezes. And so there's this father and son scientists, the Zimovs, that run a place called Pleistocene Park.
Right.
And they found that the difference between areas where animals, I'm not sure if it was reindeer or other animals, because they're dealing with a lot of different animals, moose and, you know, different muskox and the like, that the difference between areas where there were animals and areas where there were not animals is that where there were animals was 30 degrees Celsius cooler.
Wow. That's astonishing. And correct me if I'm wrong, but they've also, they've sort of talked vaguely, at least, about sort of de-extincting or de-extinctifying, whatever the verb there is, you know, mammoths and mastodons and other sort of historic elephant-like creatures. Do you feel like do we need those truly massive grazers to achieve the full effects, or, you know, can we accomplish something similar with reindeer, muskox, the kind of the tools or the animal tools that haven't yet gone extinct?
Yeah, I'm not sure if they personally are in that de-extinction camp, but I know that they are working with contemporary analogs of those animals. And I have not studied de-extinction, but I would say, why don't we start with what we have, if for no other reason that we know that the presence of these animals, know that they are adaptive to what the conditions are today.
Right, that makes perfect sense. This is going to sound like a bit of a non sequitur, but have you seen the movie Frozen 2, the Disney movie?
No, I haven't.
Okay, I think it's I just saw it last weekend, and it's actually about Indigenous reindeer herders in Scandinavia. Yeah, so I think you should talk to Disney about some kind of cross promotional opportunity. But what I think the movie, and, you know, I was reading later that the movie's producers sort of consulted very closely with Norwegian Indigenous people to get the details right. But what I think the movie gets at really nicely, actually, and what your book of course also gets at is, you know, the ways in which reindeer kind of straddle this line between wild and domestic. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that. I mean, they're this biological tool, essentially, for healing the tundra, and they're loosely managed by Indigenous people, which is also very controversial. The Norwegian government, as you write, you know, wants to sort of thin the herds. Yeah, I wonder if you could sort of talk about like reindeer as this animal that straddles these wild and domestic lines, and is controversial in its way.
Yeah, so about straddling the lines between wild and domestic, that's a really, really interesting point, because I think a lot of people feel that a wild animal is of value, but a domestic animal can be dispensed with because, well, you know, that has to do with humans, and, you know, we don't need them. We can eat plant-based meat and all that, you know, we can go off on those tangents. But I think what's really important, what you're bringing up, is the relationship between many indigenous cultures and these animals. And that is just something we really need to honor. These different groups of people have found ways to work with animals and to live in some very harsh and challenging landscapes. And they can be our teachers, and they have a lot to tell us. And interesting, I forget how long the Sami people have been with us, maybe 30,000 years or something like that. I'm just guessing. But that is interesting that, in a way, maybe at some point there was a loss of the predator population in the far north. And so people worked with the animals in a way to move the animals in the landscape in a way that is beneficial to the landscape, in a similar way that in holistic management, human managers take on the role of the predator by keeping animals on the move, because there are not enough predators, or the way that land has been divided and built over has interfered with the natural predator-prey relationship.
Right, right. To your point about how important it is that we look to indigenous understandings of wild animals. I mean, one of the things that sort of most astonished me as I dug into the role of beavers in native cultures in North America was just how deep the kind of ecological knowledge was. I mean, that probably shouldn't be surprising at all. But what's, for example, in the eastern United States, tribes tended to participate in the Western fur trade very happily, because they recognized that by trapping beavers, you're basically causing their ponds to drain and creating these big grassy meadows that were wonderful forage for moose and deer and other huntable animals. So that they essentially participated in the fur trade as a way of creating hunting grounds for themselves. But as the fur trade moved westward to the dry, arid American West, tribes like the Blackfeet actually had cultural prohibitions against killing beavers, because they understood how important beavers were in creating these oases in a very dry landscape. So that kind of the way that different native people understood beavers was very heterogeneous, depending on the kind of landscape they were on, and I just found that so interesting. And now, of course, we've lost that understanding. We manage beavers as pests in many cases. We kill them for the perceived offenses of of cutting down trees and building their dams and flooding roads and property. I wondered if you could speak a little bit to the way that we've just lost our understanding of the role that these animals play, and we manage species as quote unquote pests, when we could be working with them and utilizing them. And I'm really thinking of your chapter about the donkey project, the wild donkey project in Australia, because donkeys, are a species that I had never given two thoughts to as an ecological tool, but in some ways they seem to kind of occupy this similar space as beavers, in that they're an animal that's beloved in some quarters and hated in others. So what's the deal with donkeys?
Yeah, so this is really interesting, and actually in Australia, and this photo is This photo is a picture of someone named Chris Hengler, who manages and I wrote about him extensively in Water in Plain Sight. He manages a tract of land the size of the 5 boroughs of New York. I mean, a huge, huge station. That's what they call it. They call these large farms or these large bits of land in Australia, like in the most remote area. You can only get there by plane because to road miles, he said, would not be economical. So he works with cattle. The product of the Kachana Pastoral Company is restored land. That is his work. And so he's a very keen observer, and there are areas on his land that cattle will not go. So in the meantime, in his state, Western Australia, donkeys were brought to the country as pack animals. This is in the late 1800s. Now, one fact about donkeys is that they live a long time, sometimes upwards of 40 years. Wow. So in that time, maybe, well, first of all, in Australia, cars and trucks came along. So donkeys were not needed. Or perhaps the person who was using them moved to a city, or maybe they died. So they had all these donkeys around. So these donkeys, and they are very clever animals, they banded together and they made their way across the landscape, finding forage and, doing all the things that donkeys would do. To the government of Western Australia and many of the people there, donkeys are pests. They shouldn't be there. They're not our animals, okay? They don't belong here. Now, Chris Hengler, he is working on restoring that landscape. A huge challenge in that landscape is wildfires. So one of the factors in wildfires is that when you have a lot of brush that in the dry season can dry out and become tinder for fire. Right. He realized that the donkeys were doing a great job of managing the brush and reducing either the occurrence, the number of fires or the size of the fires. In fact, he goes so far as to say that one of the factors in the intensity of the wildfires in his state is that so many donkeys have been killed. So he is trying, he's been trying to do what education he can and explain to people in his state, explain to the authorities the role that these donkeys can play. And so he's undergoing the Wild Donkey Project. He's trying to see really what the impact is and show how meaningful their presence are. I mean, it's so sad about these donkeys, about how many are killed, and needlessly, when this landscape is hungering for management. And right. I just want to say one thing about Chris Hengler. I love the way he talks about animals and humans, the way he talks about the landscape. So he talks about humans as upper management. He talks about cattle, and I suppose donkeys, as middle management. Plants are lower management. And microorganisms are the workers.
Right. So how can we be more enlightened upper managers, I guess, is the question. More in tune with the needs of our coworkers, our colleagues. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I think that because my brain just relates everything to beavers now. I mean, I think that's one of the primary rationales for beaver restoration here in the American West too, is wildfire. You know, I live in Eastern Washington, a place where, you know, a couple summers ago, you basically couldn't leave the house because it was so smoky. And beavers, of course, by creating ponds and wetlands, you know, water doesn't burn. They're creating these amazing fire refugia and fire breaks on the landscape. And, you know, there are places where you can see literally that, you know, a wildfire has burned to the edge of a beaver complex, like the one in that picture. And, you know, and just stops in its tracks. And, you know, one hill slope is black and the other side is green because the beavers have basically halted that fire, which is just amazing to me. So to be the, you know, I loved the concept, the term that was new to me that you used in association with donkeys, which was invisible megafauna. What are invisible megafauna, and how does that apply not only in Australia, but also to our own landscapes in North America?
Interesting. So this is a term that I learned from a woman named Ariane Wallach, who is a wildlife biologist in Australia. And she has a really interesting critique of the field of conservation. And she's part of a movement called compassionate conservation. So she poses the question, who decides what is a wild land? What is the land? Who decides what the landscape is supposed to be? Like, often there's a kind of cutoff. So in Australia, it's the moment that white people arrived in Australia. This is what we see. This is what the landscape is. This is what we must return to. I guess she quoted writer Emma Maris in saying, calling that the white dude moment. Mm. So, but that frames what conservationists feel we should be working to preserve, or what animals don't belong here. So by invisible megafauna, she means animals that are not kind of what people think of as the animals belonging to a place, such as the donkeys, the wild donkeys. And therefore, they are unseen. They are unseen in terms of their value, but they're also unseen in terms of what's actually going on in the landscapes where they are operating. So in Australia, it's very interesting because we know that at the end of the Pleistocene era, Australia lost so many species of large megafauna, like the diprotons. Did I say that right? Anyway, I just have the picture in my mind. There was this incredible creature that looked like a giant wombat. There were all these incredible different creatures in Australia that died out for probably a combination of reasons. But for that reason, the Australian landscape has in many ways been defined by the lack of these animals in the last 40,000 years. So what Ariane Wallach talks about is how the advent of the wild donkeys, Cape buffalo, and camels in Australia represent a vast, successful rewilding event that has remained invisible. You ask about North America. I wonder what you have in mind. I don't know what we would, I'd love to know what you think.
I'm not sure. I mean, you know, but certainly, of course, we had our own parallel Pleistocene extinction. You know, of course, we had mammoths and mastodons and ground sloths and, you know, armadillos the size of SUVs, and lest we not forget, giant beavers. You know, beavers the size of black bears, including in Massachusetts. To me, I feel like, you know, our continent must surely have experienced an analogous loss to the one that Australia did. And yeah, I wonder what species are now playing that invisible megafauna role, and you know, and what species might do that in the future. I mean, certainly the most obvious candidate to me is bison. You know, this animal that was ubiquitous before the white dude moment, as Emma Maris put it. I like that term, and is now confined to just a couple of little tiny pockets, but is being restored to some extent of its native range, in most cases in partnership with Native American tribes. So it seems like using bison to rewild the landscape and kind of make that Pleistocene wrong right again might be one option we have.
Yeah, and we see people doing that in places. I'm sure you know of Isabella Tree's work in England of bringing analogs to animals that are no longer there, to restore the landscape, manage them in a way which may be kind of laissez-faire management to some extent, and see what happens. And I just love her work, or what she's documented. I know she's not the only one that's done that, but she's done such a beautiful job of documenting it when the results have greatly exceeded their expectations.
Right.
In terms of the creatures that just appear now, the butterflies, the birds, the white storks, they brought them in, but they're breeding now, which is really amazing. Right.
Yeah, one of the chapters of my beaver book is set in the UK, where beavers have just very recently been reintroduced. And they've been extinct there for a couple of hundred years, and one of the things that struck me during my time in England was just how lucky we are in North America to still have the wildlife we do. There they had moose and bison and bears and wolves and lynx and all kinds of creatures which were extirpated, and we've really retained the entirety of our megafauna pretty much. I mean, not of course at a small fraction of its historic range, but we're not talking about reintroducing animals entirely here. We're just talking about coexisting with creatures that are already on the landscape. And I just came back from the UK reflecting on how fortunate we are in North America to have the fauna we do.
I am totally with you. We don't know what we have.
Yeah. So I think that we want to turn it over to audience questions in a few minutes. But the last thing that I wanted to ask you before we turn to some audience questions is, one of the things that always impresses me about your work is its very global scope. This book has, in addition to what we talked about, reindeer and donkeys. You've got chapters on reforestation in China and water conservation in deserts in the Middle East. And Water in Plain Sight was an equally kind of globe-trotting epic book. I'm curious, how do you choose the stories and the places and the projects you want to highlight when the entire world is kind of your oyster?
Mostly serendipity. So for Water in Plain Sight, I had the opportunity to go to Zimbabwe. And that was absolutely extraordinary, to visit with Alan Savory and spend time with him on the land, and just to be with someone who is that attuned to every nuance of the landscape was just such a gift. But yeah, a lot of it is luck and what comes up and what piques my curiosity. That's really how it happens.
Yeah. Do you ever, one of the balances that I felt like I was trying to strike in my beaver book and in a lot of my articles as well is just, the tension between being solutions oriented, but also not wanting to overpromise, right? My book is basically about the ability of this big aquatic rat essentially to help us address drought and flood and wildfire and biodiversity loss and to sequester carbon, and I think that's one comment I always get from people is sort of like, can beavers really do all that? How do we know that? How do you your work is so optimistic in some ways. How do you strike a balance or walk a tightrope between that optimism and making sure you're always grounded in science and evidence-based?
just work really hard to do that. And I guess because I always have an editor in the back of my head, I'm just that kind of writer, just asking, okay, can I do that? And that was especially a challenge in this book. This book was a very different process because our ecological circumstances have become increasingly dire, that I couldn't just kind of hang out in the realm of solutions in the same way. For this one, I had to really grapple with how difficult it was and go through my own kind of grief about that and an acceptance of the unknown. We don't know, but we know what's, so I guess that the balance that I have here is, we don't know if we can get there, it's up to us, but we know what's possible because this is what we've seen happen here. Does that make sense as a kind of balance?
It does, yeah. I wonder how, how our present pandemic moment has changed that calculus for you. It's a fascinating time, in that we're experiencing in some ways, I think, the limits of international cooperation, and that we've kind of become this weird entrenched isolationist nation that refuses to learn from other countries, which is very disheartening. But at the same time, it's also been, I think, a period that's shown the resilience of nature, right? I read an article recently about, just the dramatic declines in roadkill rates, for example, as people sort of slow down and travel less. And you of course always see these articles about animals returning to X, Y, and Z city that humans have kind of retreated from. Does COVID change your thinking about any of the topics that you write about?
No, it's just more so. It's just that I've long felt that nature wants to heal, and the anecdotal evidence that we get of different places that are seeing ecological healing as we have less flight, as we have less traffic. And I see it here. We had an incredible bird season in the spring, lots of butterflies, lots of dragonflies, and clearer skies. So there it is. It's aligning with nature, right, and getting out of the way.
Yeah, step out of the way, and the mantra of the Beaver believers is let the rodent do the work. Get out of the way and let these animals take over. Right. So thanks, Judy. So with that, I'm going to kick it to Adam, who I think is going to relay some audience questions as well.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Judy. We have a few questions here. I'll start with Judy. How is your work received by nature writers like Terry Tempest Williams, who have long argued against ranch animals in the semi-arid Western United States?
Wow, I don't know if she knows of my work. I've never had any encounters with Terry Tempest Williams in particular. I admire her work. But I guess it would probably vary by person. So I can't really generalize. Certainly there are people in the field that are also exploring similar themes.
Okay, let's try for another one. Can you talk about the relationship between wolves, willows, and beaver in Yellowstone?
I'll take that for sure. There is a chapter in my book about exactly this question. So, to me, I think that the Yellowstone story, in which wolves are the hero, is a pretty simplified version in some ways. Of course, because I'm a shameless beaver booster and apologist. I think that the beavers really get short shrift in that story. In that, we tend. We think about wolves as doing all of the work, but really the most important thing that wolves did was basically make it possible for beavers to come back, right? It's the kind of the story in Yellowstone. The classic story is that wolves were deliberately extirpated by the Park Service. Elk became overabundant and ate all of the riparian vegetation, And the reason that was so problematic really was that it made it impossible for beavers to survive. And you look at old pictures of Yellowstone, and there were watersheds that today are basically like dry pasture land that were underwater thanks to beavers. And when wolves died out, or were killed, that eliminated beavers. And when wolves were reintroduced, that primarily made it possible for beavers to do their thing, to create ponds and wetlands and rehydrate some of those valleys. So I try to tell a version of that story in my book that really centers beavers. And I think that those two animals, wolves and beavers, are they're keystone species. They're ecosystem engineers in their own ways, and they certainly work together closely. But I like to talk less about Yellowstone's wolves and more about their beavers for sure.
We have another question here. The True Nature Project reports on restoring tundra in Eastern Europe using horses, auroch-like animals developed in the Netherlands. And fostering research on which animals are best suited to rewild specific ecosystems. Judy, are you familiar with their work, the True Nature Project?
No, I'm not, and I just wrote it down. So
okay.
Thank you.
You will be familiar with it.
It's going to be a chapter in Judy's next book.
Right.
Here's a question of how can this idea of learning from nature be applied to support farmers? Can farmers be funded based on the richness of microbes in their soil and health of the middle managers and the upper managers that depend on the soil?
I'd say that's a great idea, or certainly for that to be valued. I mean, but I would say that farmers are definitely doing this now. Regenerative farmers are absolutely looking to nature and focusing on biodiversity on the landscape and working with how animals manage water and all of that. Ben, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, in the beaver world, there's a really sizable and rapidly growing agricultural community of beaver believers, especially on the ranching side. I think that the crop farmers are not as enthusiastic yet because the beavers tend to kind of mess with irrigation infrastructure mostly. But the ranching community very much appreciates beavers as creators of water sources for cattle and also for irrigators, right? I mean, beavers, in addition to creating ponds, they're also rehydrating soils. They're incredible agents of groundwater recharge, which produces more plants, which means more weight on your cattle and money in your back pocket. So there's a really strong community of beaver believers in the livestock world. And I do think it's important to support that community somehow. I mean, I think that one of the, this is certainly true of beavers, and it's true of wolves, and it's true of really all kinds of sort of flora and fauna, and is that and just speaking about beavers specifically, I mean, there's a tension, I think, between private costs and public benefits, by which I mean that beavers are providing all of these wonderful services for we the people, right? They're sequestering carbon for us. They're improving our water quality. They're dampening wildfire for us. They're producing more fish and wildlife that we like to catch and hunt. There's all of these wonderful kind of public ecosystem services, but the costs of having beaver on the landscape are generally borne by private landowners, right? The people whose irrigation ditches they're clogging, or whose driveways they're flooding, or whose crops they're eating in some cases. So I think that it's sort of incumbent upon us to find ways to square those private costs and public benefits. And maybe that means providing more resources to farmers and ranchers for beaver coexistence, or some kind of ecosystem services payments if you're harboring beaver on your land. But figuring out, I think, how to square private costs and public benefits, that kind of gets to the heart, I think, of the challenge of beaver management.
Yeah, I'll just add, that's a really, really good point. And part of the disconnect that really drove me from writing about economics to writing about ecology is that in our economic model, nature has a value of 0. Whereas when you think about everything that you said, the hydrated landscapes, I mean, all of the costs and that don't have to be spent, you know, like for all that irrigation and fire management and all of that, but it's just invisible. It's invisible like those invisible megafauna were.
Judy, here's a question for you.
Oh boy.
Have you started thinking about your next book?
Oh, that's a really easy question to answer. No.
I can't imagine why.
But you could ask Ben.
Ben, have you started thinking about Judy's next book?
Oh no.
Oh no, that's not what you meant.
There are so many great topics that Judy could write about, and whatever she writes, I will purchase. But yeah, my next book, which will hopefully be out sometime this decade, is about it's about the science of road ecology, basically how roads impact nature and how we can, you know, sort of mitigate our infrastructure to reduce the harm it inflicts upon wildlife.
Let's see. I think this is the last question, and it's for Ben. Could you talk about the relationship between beaver return and salmon repopulation in the Northwest?
Oh man, this is my favorite topic. This question might have been a plant. I don't know who asked this one, but it's a good one. Yeah, I mean, you know, fish and beavers. I mean, as I said earlier, you know, beavers taught salmon to jump, right? These are two species that have a very deep evolutionary history, and you know, we know that beavers create incredible juvenile fish habitat, right? If you're, you know, a little finger-length trout or salmon, you don't want to live in the main stem river, right? That's like a fire hose that's going to blast you downstream. You want to live in a deep pool or an eddy or a side channel or a backwater. You know, you want that slow water refuge habitat that beaver dams create so well. And that doesn't just apply to salmon in the Northwest. I mean, that applies to brook trout and, you know, and anadromous fish in the Northeast as well. I mean, these are all, you know, I mean, basically every species of fish, you know, does, or at least their juvenile version does well in beaver created habitat. So I would say that, I mean, as much as anything, it's the importance of salmon recovery, which are so integral to economies and cultures in the Northwest, that's driving this passion for beavers now. You know, it really was, you know, the initial beaver restoration projects in the Northwest were really aimed at creating salmon habitat, especially among native tribes. You know, I mean, out here in Washington, we've got the Tulalip tribe, the Yakima, the Cowlitz. You know, there are all of these indigenous tribes who are working on beaver restoration, primarily because they care about salmon. And beavers create salmon, so it's a really deep connection, and I think, you know, a very important theme of beaver restoration is fish habitat.
Great, thank you, Ben. And I'm going to sneak in one final question, and that is for both of you. Do you have some advice for aspiring environmental journalists?
Wow,
that's a good question.
Yeah. Do you have something to say?
Well, I guess I'll just say briefly that, I mean, it's funny. I talked to Judy when I was an aspiring environmental journalist. You know, she was actually a source for an article I wrote many years ago, and you know, I think that the advice that she gave me that really sticks with me is the importance of writing books. You know, I think that you know, that articles, I mean, of course, there are so many wonderful articles being written out there every single day. But, you know, there's something about a book, I think, a tangible physical artifact that can live on people's shelves and be a resource for a really long time that is meaningful. And, you know, and she described all of the ranchers who have used Cow Save the Planet as a resource and really changed the way they manage their land, thanks to Judy's work. And that was just tremendously inspiring to hear, that books can have such a remarkable, tangible impact on the world. So, you know, book writing is not for everybody, but I do think that books have this kind of cultural weight and ability to make change that maybe other forms of media don't. And that's straight from Judy's amazing mind.
I said that. I'm
you did.
So
Yeah.
I did. Yeah, just Yeah, it's a tough question because the market is so, then we're into the whole media market. But I would just say, just be curious, be observant, be determined. And yeah, that's what I would say.
I just want to say that our compendium editor, it's a compendium of mostly scientific articles supporting eco-restoration to address climate. I believe had a conversation with you, Judy, and Judy referred her. Did you refer her to The Guardian? Anyway, after Hannah's conversation with Judy, she cold called The Guardian about a topic of Miyawaki forests, which are pocket forests that are planted in cities. It's a kind of a revolutionary approach, and it's been around for 30 or 40 years. But she got her first publication. The Guardian bought her article. So
It was a fabulous article.
yeah, she did a really good job. And so here's an example of an answer to that question in what is virtually real time. And she is currently pursuing a book project with Chelsea Green, which is the publisher of Ben and Judy's books. And there you have it. Thank you very much to Ben and Judy and WGBH Forum Network.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks everybody.